Welcome to Electropainting and Refurbishing. Today we're going to go over the HazCom program as a new employee. Electropainting and Refurbishing is dedicated to safety for you as an employee. All employees must be aware of the hazards present in the manner to negate and minimize those hazards. EPR is a coatings applicator. As a coatings applicator, you are going to be exposed to chemicals. It is your responsibility to be aware of what chemicals you're working with and how to work safely with those. We will give you those tools. Today we're going to go over the HazCom, and it's a HazCom program. At this moment, you should have a hazardous communications program in your hands. If you do not, stop this video and go get one from your manager who's hired you. That's kind of what I'm saying. Page 1 of the HazCom has a quotation on it and talks about all substances are poisons. There is none which is not a poison. The right dose differentiates between a poison and a remedy. As technical director, I would add that there isn't any substance that you come into contact with that is not a chemical. All air, all water are chemicals. Many household chemicals, including cleaners, are handled and managed by general public to present both physical and health hazards. As a company, it is our responsibility to train you to how to work with chemicals and work safely and make tools out of them. Page 2 of the HazCom is nothing more than a table of contents, and it's for your future reference so that you can go back and find things easily in this. You will have a HazCom given to you, and you should have it now. Page 3 talks about the government regulations regarding the Hazardous Communication Program. CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations, and it is published by the United States government and applies to all businesses to make sure that everybody follows the same rules. 1910.1200 is specific to the hazardous communication, and in that code it talks about what is required. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, is the entity of the United States government that makes sure that all workers work safe and that all companies have to follow those rules. Below this is a list of all the OSHA regulations around the country per your branch. All branches are operating either under the federal guidelines or under state guidelines that adopted federal guidelines. None have adopted a different code. By law, they have to adopt at least the federal guidelines. They can be more stringent, but right now, all the branches are operating under federal guidelines. Page 4 is a general overview of HazCom requirements. There are this is employee information and training, which we are doing today, and it's an ongoing process. Employers shall provide employees with effective information and training on hazardous chemicals in their work area at the time of their initial assignment and whenever new physical and health hazard employees have not been previously trained or introduced to their work area. At Electropainting, everything that we have has been tested and gone through with corporate. I, as technical director, look at anything new that comes in. You should not be provided with new chemicals other than the ones that are on our list, unless that they have been evaluated by first the manager and then me. If you go out, you shall never go out and buy something on your own without previous approval from the manager and from me. Employees shall be informed of the requirements of this section, which we're doing right now. Any operations in their work area where hazardous chemicals are present, we will do that later. The location and availability of the written hazardous communication, including the required list of hazardous chemicals and material safety data sheets. Every branch has material safety data sheets and safety data sheets in their possession for all the products that they have. If you go out and you buy Windex for a job site, you have to have an MSDS for it by law. The Hazardous Com, you'll be given a copy of the Hazardous Communication Program. You can also get another copy anytime you want. Anytime you want a copy of the MSDS or the SDS, you can have those. That stands for Material Safety Data Sheet and Safety Data Sheet. I'll talk about those in a little bit. Training. Employee training must include at least methods and observations that may be used to detect the presence or release of hazardous chemicals in the work area, such as monitoring conducted by the employer, continuous monitoring devices, visual appearance of odor, and hazardous chemicals when being released. The vast majority of what you will do is the third one, and that is the appearance of odor and the hazardous chemicals by smell. The monitoring conducted by employer has been done by us. We have been involved in several industrial hygienist reports, and those are readily available to you to look at. Physical and health hazards of the chemical in the work area, which we're going over. The measures that the employees can take to protect themselves from these hazards. With what we do, that will be almost primarily safety equipment. You will be provided with gloves, safety glasses, respirators. All of these are always readily available to you. If they are not readily available to you, you need to make your manager aware of it at that moment. And if That you do not get a response, and you will make a call to me. My number will be in this book. The details of the HazCom program as developed by the employer, including that's what we're doing right now. So we don't really need to go over that. Each employee who may be exposed when working must be provided with information. Every employee of electropainting will be exposed. We are a painting company. There are solvents in our coating. Every industry that you work in has hazards associated with it. Almost every industry that you can work in will have chemical hazards that you will be exposed to. Ours is no different because we go on site and because we paint at our customers' sites. We have been very regulated and work with the safest possible combination of coatings that you can, and have developed procedures in order to minimize those dangers. All that's required from you as an employee is common sense. If you use the tools we give you, you will protect yourself. You have value to us as a healthy employee. Each employee who may be exposed must be provided with information. As I said, all employees will be exposed. The CFR requires that a hazardous communication program specifically addresses these subjects. There's a list of what must be addressed here. You're welcome to go over that. We are going to go over that as we go through this program. Page 5 of the HazCom deals with the tiers of responsible parties. And there are 4 tiers in this company. First is Regional and Technical and Safety Director. That's me. I am at the top of this. I have written and produced this program. The second is going to be your main contact, and that is your local safety directors. There is a listing in here later on who the local safety director is. That is going to be your branch manager. That is who you always go to first with any questions or any comments. Top tier labor employees are going to be crew leaders and guys who are responsible for other people on their crews. You will never be a top tier employee as of initial hire, despite your level of experience. You will always be trained. Once you may reach that point quickly, but you will not be there initially hired. Initial hire, you are standard labor, no matter what your experience level is. Standard labor, the only responsibility you have as standard labor is to take care of yourself, to be aware. And it says here, responsible to attend all training which you are doing, and responsible for maintaining and practicing a level of knowledge to be assured to personal safety. As a crew leader, what you will be doing is you'll be required to do that, as well as making sure everybody around you is following those same programs and following those same safe practices. Below this is a listing of the EPR branches and personnel. That's straightforward. You can look for your list. At any time that you do not get an answer that you are satisfied with, you can come to me as technical director. I am listed in here as well. If there's something that's questionable, I will get involved. After that, we have a chemical inventory. This lists everything that you will be working with on a standard basis at electropainting and refurbishing. It looks like a long list, but it really isn't. The first thing on this list is urethanes, and you'll never be working with more than one urethane at any given time, and chances are there's only going to be 1 or 2 that are in your standard toolbox. There's a lot that get spec'd. There are different types of urethanes. You look on this list and you can see there's multiple depth tanks, 378 and 379. That's because there's a list for each type, semi-gloss, gloss. There's not a lot of chemical differences, but you have to have safety data sheets for each and every one. The next one would be epoxy. The same rule applies here. You're never going to be working with more than one epoxy at any given time, but sometimes you're working with an excess epoxy, which has multiple bases and multiple catalysts. All basically the same thing, but we have each one listed. And then you have reducers. There's multiple reducers. There's going to be 2 standard ones. And then colorants is in your colorant machine, and it's something that we're going to have and never going to change. Cleaners, adhesive, and miscellaneous items. That list is available to you. You can go over it. You can see MSDSs and SDSs for any of those items that you wish, and will be made readily available to you through the manager. And if you cannot get them, you contact me again as technical director. Physical hazards and chemicals worked with at EPR. You'll be working with urethane and epoxy coatings, which you just went over, as well as solvents. These coatings are solvent-based and almost always present the physical hazards of flammability, explosiveness. Very rarely will you see reactivity as long as you follow the rules. Some of them can be reactive if you mix the wrong things. You never put an acid with a urethane base. You do not mix acid with anything. Never mix anything that's not supposed to be mixed with something else. If we give you a product, we're going to give you a part A and part B. It's going to be marked very specifically. It's going to be labeled very specifically from the manufacturer. You do not put a product from Evo with a product from Sumner. You do not put a product from PPG with a product from Sherwin-Williams. You do not mix anything we do not specifically tell you to mix. You will be given two components, and when you mix those two together, they're perfectly safe. There is no reactivity at all. There's corrosiveness, and it's associated with some of the acid-based cleaners that you work with, but they're very mild acids. At this point, I'd like to point out that some people have their only experience with acid is what they've seen in the movies. And if you dip your hand in it, the flesh is not going to fall off. Everything in nature, again, is either acidic or basic. Basic may not be a term that you're familiar with, but basic means that it's like lye soap. And it's very, very corrosive. And if you get lye on your hands and it's wet, it will burn. That's a corrosive substance, same as a very corrosive acid. They both lie in that spectrum. Rainwater is either basic or acid, depending upon the area that you live in. You've heard about acid rain. So everything you work with will be an acid or a base. The level of corrosivity can be controlled with rubber gloves. And you always want to wear your safety glasses when you're working with an acid. If you get it in your eye, it'll burn, but it needs to be flushed out. If it's treated, there's no damage. Health hazards at EPR. Again, almost all these are going to be related directly to the solvents. You have solvents that you work with to clean with, and there's solvents in the paint. The materials in the coating you're not going to be exposed to because of how we apply with the number 2 handgun. Those materials are not air atomized. They're atomized by the spinning bell. What you have is a solvent, and you have your different routes of exposure through your solvents. The first is dermal. That's skin contact. That means you've got some solvent on your hand. When you're working with solvent for extended period of time, just wear rubber gloves, and again, you should have safety goggles on or safety glasses. But what we work with, again, is put out there in the public. I won't work with anything. I won't let you work with anything that I don't work with, and I qualify everything we work with. So you should wear rubber gloves. The main thing with dermal that I always tell all new employees is that you have to be careful. If you put solvent on a rag and you put it in your pocket, it will burn, and you can get a solvent burn. What you need to do is you have to take that solvent off and put a wet rag between your pants leg and the pants. You don't want cloth with solvent laying against your skin. It's not going to do any long-term damage. It's a irritant rather than a damage. It causes a skin burn. It's not something permanent, but it hurts. That's all I can say, and you only do it once and you'll learn. Eye contact, splashes in the eyes. This is going to happen at some point or another. You're going to get solvent in your eye, you're going to get paint in your eye. If you wear safety glasses, you can prevent that. If you do get solvent in your eye, it's important that you rinse your eye out. You need to know your routes to your bathrooms when you're on a strange job site. You need to know where that water is, and you can rinse your eye out. I manufactured coatings for 15 years. I can tell you that I got gallons of solvents at one time splashed in my face, and what it takes is to rinse that solvent out of your eyes, and it will burn when you get it in. You need to know where that route is to that bathroom. So your responsibility as any employee, new or top tier, is when you go on a strange job site, is to know the routes to that water and that bathroom. So that your responsibility as any employee is if someone gets solvent in their eye, is you grab them by the arm and you take them to the restroom to rinse their eye out. They should rinse their eye out for 3 to 5 minutes. At that point, if it's continuing to be irritated, at that point they should go to the clinic, at which point they will flush the eye again. That's all they're going to do for solvent. I've been through this, I know. The next route is ingestion, swallowing. I was trained many years ago, and I like to joke, don't eat the paint. That's a good rule of thumb. You do not eat the paint. It goes deeper than that. You want to make sure you keep your hands clean. You don't want to smoke or eat after you've been painting until you wash your hands. But after that, it's fine. You should never ingest paint. The epoxies, you get a little bit in your mouth, and I've had it there. I manufactured coatings. You get a little bit in your mouth, and you're going to taste it. You're going to get enough in there that you're certainly not going to swallow. You're going to spit it out. You want to rinse your mouth out and get the taste out of your mouth. Actually, I found one of the best things to do this with is soda. Inhalation is your main source of exposure in this company, and that means you're smelling the odors, you're breathing the odors. And as you're putting on paint, solvent evaporates out. You are going to smell it. There is an odor associated with it. One of the great misconceptions is that because you can smell it, it's dangerous. That's not true. If you look at odor thresholds, which is the measure by which it takes for you to smell something, and permissible exposure limits, which is the amount that you can be exposed to, as defined by OSHA, there's a huge gap in the solvents that we work. You will be able to smell a solvent long before it becomes dangerous to you. This does not mean you shouldn't respect it. It just means that just because you smell something doesn't necessarily mean you're in a situation that's dangerous. It is your way of telling that the solvent's out there. If it's irritating your throat, if it's irritating your lungs, if it's irritating anything, you should go immediately to fresh air. And before that point, you should have put your mask on. The next section talks about precautionary methods to avoid exposure. While the routes listed above may sound intimidating to the employee, the seasoned veteran knows that once again all these hazards can be eliminated by simply following some simple safety rules, and it comes down to common sense for almost everybody. EPR will provide PPE. This stands for personal protective equipment. It's safety equipment. That's a uniform term. You will find it on MSDSs and SDSs. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But they're included are safety glasses, safety goggles, half-face respirators, vinyl gloves, and solvent-resistant gloves. If there is any safety item that you feel will help you in your job, please come forth to the manager. If it's a reasonable request and it's something we think will help, we will absolutely provide it to you. Of the items listed, they will always be available to you at the branch. The safety gloves, the mask, the chemical cartridges for those masks. They need to be always readily available, and we will always have them there. Employees shall always consult the MSDS and container labeling when starting work. And once you've worked with an epoxy and you're familiar with it, that's fine. You know what epoxies are. You always wear gloves and other protective clothing. If we provide you with gloves to work with solvent, then you need to wear those gloves to work with solvent. You always wear proper eye protection when required. You always wash your hands after working prior to eating, drinking, or smoking. This is a very big one. Again, I covered it once already. You need to wash your hands. It seems like common sense. Always ensure that proper ventilation exists as required by the MSDS. This is going to be generally taken care of ahead of time before you're on any job site. We control our ventilation in our shops, and when you're on job sites, for the coatings that we apply, what is required is normal ventilation, which means HVAC, the heating and air conditioning. Us as managers ensure that heating and air conditioning is left on overnight so there's ventilation going on. There will be the rare occasion when you're working in tight spaces with bathrooms that you will want to put a mask on. And if you're a new guy, your crew leader will certainly make you aware of that. You should be aware of that by the effect it has on your body and the smell, that it's bothering your eyes. And as an older guy, you'll know that you need to do that. As a trained veteran, you know that you need to do that. And at any time that you wish to wear your mask, you're welcome to wear your mask. EPR does not tell you at any point that you cannot wear your organic respirator. It's always available to you. Organic cartridge is always available to you. Always wear protective respirators is the next line. We just covered that. And then it goes through some of the different times that you'll wear it. Most epoxy coatings, the ones that I was just talking about when we go on site, do not require the use of a respirator. If you want to wear it, you can. Epoxy is applied in smaller areas, bathroom stalls I just went over. Yes, you should be wearing a respirator. Urethane coatings painted outside do not require the use of a respirator. One of the things that are true of all gases is that they go as far as they can, as fast as they can. That means they expand. There's no limit to their volume from a chemical standpoint. So this is the reason why I was talking earlier about the smell. If I paint on the far side of a factory, someone that walks in the door 100 yards over walks in and says they can smell it. It's because those molecules are expanding as fast as they can. What this does is minimize your concentration. When you're outdoor, there's nothing to contain these vapors, and they're gone as fast as they're put out there. If you're using urethane coatings in a controlled environment, such as in our shop, you should always use extra ventilation and use of a respirator. You're not going to use urethane coatings other than in our shop. And at that point, you should absolutely have a respirator on. There may be small exceptions to that, but it'll be on contract on GC jobs, on new construction jobs, and that will all be worked out with through the manager and through you. You still will wear your respirator, but the ventilation won't necessarily be there. But no one else will be on site, and then you cannot be spraying urethane around other people. Methods of detection of exposure, we covered this a little bit. The primary part is for the dermal is you got burning of the skin. For the eye, you have burning of the eye. For inhalation, you may have dizziness. If you experience dizziness when spraying, what you should do is get to fresh air. That should be your immediate response. And I'll go over this again, but I want to be redundant about that. Soreness of the throat is from inhalation or ingestion. Nausea is from inhalation or ingestion, which means breathing or eating it. Vomiting is from ingestion, which again means eating it. You should never be in a situation where you're eating paint. That should never happen. There's no reason why you should ever have paint around your mouth. You need to make sure your hands are washed and you're not spraying in a manner that's going to get paint in your mouth. Common first aid procedures, we've gone over these, but I will go over them again. Skin contact is immediately wash the area affected. Most skin burns are the result of exposure to a solvent or corrosive. If redness persists or irritation develops, seek medical attention. If redness persists or skin irritation develops, seek medical attention. Eye contact, if related to a splash, immediately rinse the eyes out with clean water for no less than 15 minutes. If burning persists, consult medical attention. Most times 5 minutes will be adequate, but continue to do it just to be safe. If related to spraying in a small area, this is because there's fumes and your eyes have become irritated from that. At that point, you need to get out into fresh air, let them clear up. You should probably put on some safety goggles if you need them to go back into that area. Ingestion. Never induce vomiting. If someone else has for some reason ate the paint, never make them vomit. If anybody eats the paint in any quantities for some reason, then you need to seek medical attention at this point. You can have them rinse their mouth out with water if it's just in their mouth. Again, this has never happened in my 35 years of experience. No one is going to be eating the paint. You will get paint or solvent in your mouth. It's not the end of the world. I've done it. You rinse your mouth out. If for some reason you swallowed that, then you can rinse your mouth out, and I don't know how that's ever going to happen. Inhalation, again, we went over this. You will inhale solvents, you will inhale vapors. If you get it to the point where you're irritated or you're dizzy, you want to get fresh air. If you're in a situation where that's happening, you should be wearing your mask. The industrial hygienist reports show that you can spray epoxy perfectly fine without the respirator. It's strictly voluntary. Again, we don't stop you from wearing it during that time. You're welcome to. It's not required. The next section of the HazCom talks about hazards associated with non-routine tasks. A non-routine task is something that you would be called upon to do that you have never been called upon to do before and is not in our regular standard basis. First, as an initial employee, all tasks are non-routine tasks, but you will have a crew leader with you who has done these day in, day out. He will be doing that. As someone who's leading a job, if you're being asked to do something that you have never done, it has to have been discussed and talked about with the manager before we ever do it. A project manager on a job site for someone else, some other company, cannot tell you to do something that we have not done. A common example of this would be closed container work, where you would go inside of a cylinder or something with very limited airflow and be expected to spray inside that cylinder. We will never do that without discussing it with you. The manager would discuss it with me. We would talk about what was required to do that. You would be trained with what was required to do that. So this section here talks about non-routine tasks, and then at the very end of it, it talks about no employee shall make the decision to perform non-routine tasks without the express consent of the local safety director, who is your manager. No employee will inquire hazardous materials not addressed in this manual without express consent by the local safety director, which is the manager, which goes back to what I said earlier. You can't just go out and buy chemicals and use them. You have to get that approved from your manager. It is the responsibility of the local safety director to assess these hazards associated with all tasks performed by EPR employees and provide the training and equipment to perform that task. Going back to what I said earlier, it's very important to understand that as a company, we're very dedicated to your safety. Again, it's just common business sense. We all spend a lot of time talking to each other. I'm on the phone with guys. They talk to me. I talk to them. We all make these decisions as a group, and we make sure that you work in the best and most safe, most productive manner possible. The next section that we're going to talk about is really the meat of the program, and it is material safety data sheets, which you will hear referred to as MSDSs, and safety data sheets. It's important for you to know that these are basically synonymous with each other. To give you a little history, MSDSs, material safety data sheets, were what were originally required by the federal government, and it is a listing of the product and what the hazards are associated with that product. As of 2012, the federal government changed the format, and they are now called SDSs, or safety data sheets. There's nothing different. You'll get the same information from both of these sheets, but right now in the interim you will see both MSDSs and safety data sheets. As our vendors get updated and as we get updated, it will be more just the safety data sheets. The important thing to know about the material safety data sheets is they are a source of information for you. It's important that you're being familiar with the material safety data sheet and the format, how to get this information. There are a few sections in the MSDS that were required. This is the MSDS, not the SDS. We'll go over them in a second. But the MSDS that were originally built, the section 1 was the supplier's information. This has no relevant value to you as an employee. It basically tells us where we bought it from, who the supplier is. Section 2 is the hazardous ingredients. This is important. This tells you what's in there and what you're being exposed to. Section 3 is the physical and chemical characteristics. This section describes the chemical in terms such as boiling point, melting point, vapor pressure, vapor density, and solubility in water. It will also describe the physical appearance and the odor of the product. This section really has very little value to it other than it describes the odor, but you're going to know when you're smelling solvent. The solvents that we use are very limited, and you're going to know when you're smelling solvent. The rate of evaporation talks about how it will evaporate, the quickness of it will evaporate, and the relevant need for ventilation. Vapor density allows you to let you know which way the solvent's going to go. A vapor density that has a density greater than 1 will fall to the ground. Everything we work with has a vapor density greater than 1. The concentration down here below will always be higher than it is up high. The appearance and odor can be used to determine if an open container has been tampered with. Section 4 is fire and explosion data. This is basically tells you what your flash point is, and I always like to take a break here and describe flash point because there are some misconceptions sometimes. Flash point is the point at which a material will ignite given a source of ignition. It's not the point at which the material will just burst into flames. That's spontaneous combustion. You will not be working with anything that has a spontaneous combustion with any temperature that you could ever be around. You'd already be dead if the product spontaneously combusted. Flash point is the point at which it will burn if a source of ignition is around. So if you take this product and it has a flash point of 100 and you have a spark and it's 85 out, it's not going to flash. That doesn't mean it won't burn if you hold a light up to it. Okay? You can take a solvent rag and try and prove me wrong and hold a match or a lighter up to it. It'll burn because the match or the lighter is raising the temperature there. But in your standard environment, out here it's 85, you're not creating a flammable environment in this atmosphere because you don't have that higher temperature. And then below this in bold it says EPR is a coatings applicator and all solvents should be treated as flammable solvents. No employee should smoke or otherwise introduce a source of ignition when working with coatings. It's important to note that the gun is not a source of ignition. It will dead short out before it gets to that point where it sparks. Section 5 is reactivity data. This section details the reactions that could occur when this material is introduced to other chemicals. We covered this earlier. You will not be mixing anything that's not supposed to be mixed with something else. Nothing that we work with, when mixed with what is properly supposed to be mixed with, will react other than paint getting hard. There's not going to be a violent or a negative reactivity there. Section 6 is health hazard data. It's the second most important section to you. It discusses the exposure that can occur and describes the health hazards that can occur from the exposure. It will also describe the symptoms of exposure and emergency first aid procedures to follow if exposure does occur. The employee should be also aware of the routes of entry, and this is a good indicator of the personal protective equipment required. All employees should be capable of consulting this section as it details the immediate first aid steps that non-medical personnel can take. Example, removing someone to fresh air if dizziness occurs. It is required that every employee, all tiers of employees, familiarize themselves with this section prior to starting work with any product. Section 7 is the most important, and it talks about safe handling and use. This tells you what PPE that you're going to be required to use. It tells you what kind of ventilation is going to be required, and it will discuss the precautions taken to avoid exposure. And let me say here that we have evaluated all these products, and that we as management are making you aware of that. But this product, this MSDS, this SDS has that information available to you as well. But any questions you have, you can take to your manager. You can see any MSDS you want, and that's fine. Section 8, control measures. This talks again about the personal protective equipment that's required. That is all that's sections that are required on an MSDS as originally produced by the government. This next section talks about the safety data sheets. And this was the new format that was brought about in 2012. And you'll see some of these. Again, they are analogous to an MSDS. They're very similar. They both provide the same information, but it's a matter of how the format was set. The SDS has Section 1 is the identification, which is the same as the MSDS. Section 2 is the hazardous identification, and you'll have these sheets in your book. You should be looking at them now, and then please take time to read through them. It'll tell you whether it's a flammable liquid. It'll tell you the precautionary statements. Section 3 is the composition and information on ingredients. This can become confusing sometimes for employees because there's a lot of big chemical names. Again, if you have any questions, please go to your manager. And if it's something he or she cannot answer, he or she will come to me and we'll get an answer for you. But it's just a list of all the chemicals and what they are. Section 4, again on the SDS, very important section, is your first aid measures. Section 5 talks about firefighting measures. We at Electro Painting and Refurbishing are very proud of our fire record. Let me say that up front, it's almost impossible to have a fire. That does not mean in any way, shape, or form that you are given the disregard to smoke around these solvents or to have sources of ignition around these solvents. You are personally responsible anytime you're on a job site not to do these things. It's just that most solvents have what we call an LEL, what the government calls an LEL. It's a definition, a lower explosive limit and an upper explosive limit. You have to fall within those guidelines in order to have an explosive or a flammable environment. On top of that, you also have to have a flash point. What we were working with on site typically has a much higher flash point, and you're never going to reach the LEL where you're creating an explosive environment. This is one of the reasons why we have such a good fire record. In the event that there's a fire, and we've had a couple, in the event that there's a fire, you should be trained on how to use a fire extinguisher, and you should know how to use it. We never want an employee to put themselves in danger. You're not a firefighter. If you cannot knock it down and contain it within the first 30 seconds, then you walk away. That's what the fire department's for. That's their job, not ours. Section 8 is accidental release measures. This talks about spills, and more will on an MSDS or an SDS is going to relate to larger spills. You spilling a quart of solvent on the floor is not reportable. It could be damaging to our profits if you do it on a job site, but it's not reportable. This section on chemical inventories and on safety data sheets relates to 55-gallon and even 250 or tanker spills. Section 7, handling and storaging. This is going to talk about, you should be familiar with this. This is going to talk about what's required as far as temperatures. You should not store it in high temp situations. If you have paint on a van and it's 110 outside, nothing bad's going to happen, but the solvent could expand, it could pop lids. It's really not a good idea. Same thing with it being cold. There's no true physical hazard associated with it, but it's just not a good general idea, and again, it's not common sense. Section 8 is exposure and controls, personal protection. This goes back to the PPE that we talked about, and it's safety glasses, rubber gloves, respirators, all these things on each coating will be discussed and talked about. Section 9 is physical and chemical properties. They talk about the appearance, the odor. They'll talk about the odor threshold, pH, which is a measure of acidity, melting point, boiling point, freezing point. Again, initial boiling point and boiling range. None of these are real important to you. Flash point's important to you. You need to know if what you're working with has a flash point of 35 or has a flash point of 110. At no point do you ever introduce a source of ignition but something with a flash point of 35 is going to burn much quicker than something with a flash point of 100, so you should be aware of what you're working with. Upper and lower flammability or explosive limits we just talked about. Vapor pressure, vapor density, again, these are chemical terms. Vapor pressure talks about how fast it expands, what I was talking about earlier, the gas expands. Vapor density talks about whether it drops to the floor or not. Solubilities does not apply to you. You're not going to be mixing anything we give you with something else it's not supposed to be mixed with. Auto ignition temperature, again, nothing we work with. That goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Spontaneous combustion, auto ignition is another term used for it. Nothing that we work with is going to just burst into flames without a source of ignition. It doesn't happen. Section 10 is stability and reactivity. Reactivity goes back to what I was talking about earlier. If it will react with something violently or dangerously produce a gas that can be dangerous, you will not be exposed to anything like that. Nothing that you have will do that as long as you mix it with what it's supposed to be mixed with. You don't mix something, and I cannot reiterate this enough, it's probably the 5th or 6th time I said it, you don't mix something with something that we haven't told you to mix it with, period. Part A always goes with Part B, and we'll tell you what Part A is and we'll tell you what Part B is. Chemical stability, everything that we work with are stable. There's nothing that we have that's going to react. There are certain chemicals that are not stable, they react with light. We don't work with anything that's not stable. And then there's other lists here, but again, this does not apply. Section 11 is toxicological information. Section identifies toxicological and health effects. Basically, this is how you will be exposed and what the effects of those exposure are. It tells you how to identify that exposure, i.e. burning of the skin, burning the eyes, dizziness, and it tells you how that happened. So that pretty much covers that. Section 12 is ecological information. This is non-mandatory. This is a non-mandatory section of the SDS, and it is truly not important to you. And the reason being is because this talks about what the effects are on the ecology of this product. Say I take this gallon of paint and I dump it in a pond. You will never dump a gallon of paint for electropainting and refurbishing in a pond, period. We're very dedicated to hazardous waste handling. We deal with it. We have licensed hazardous waste handlers to deal with it, and that is another section of the training that we'll deal with later. Nothing that you have will ever go, nothing that you have that's hazardous will ever go into the ecology, will be handled through us and through our waste handlers. Section 13 is disposal considerations, is just what I talked about. It will say, does this need to be gone through by a licensed hazardous waste handler? Can it be thrown in a dumpster? What are the considerations that have to be involved there? Again, you will be given guidance on that with each and every product you work with, but no coating ever goes into a customer's dumpster. No can goes into a customer's dumpsters. Those things come back to the branch and we deal with them there. Section 14 is transport information. Again, this is completely unimportant to you. It talks about what has to happen in order for me to ship this on a truck somewhere, and it relates to shipping 50 or 60 gallons or whatever. It's the listing that has to go through from DOT. Section 15 is regulatory information that's non-mandatory. Section identifies safety, health, environmental regulations specific to the product. It's not indicated anywhere else on the SDS. And Section 16 is other information that may be revisions or anything like that. And that is it for all the sections of the safety data sheet.
No.
The next section that we're going to talk about is hazardous material labels. OSHA requires that all hazardous materials be labeled. Labels look different, but all are required to have the identity of the chemical listed on it, name and address of the chemical manufacturer, and warnings about the chemical-specific physical and health hazards. This may be multiple labels, but all hazardous material is required to be labeled with these 3 items. The employee responsibility when it comes to the use of hazardous materials is no employee shall ever remove a label from a hazardous material. Any employee moving product from a hazardous material that's properly labeled into a secondary container shall mark that container so that any other employee may easily and readily identify that material. This means that if you're taking paint out of a solvent can and putting it into another can that's unmarked, it needs to be labeled, and the minimum requirement is that it needs to be labeled as that solvent. So if it's a 119 Sherwin-Williams 119 lacquer thinner, it needs to be marked that way. If it's EP's Gun Flush, it needs to be marked EP Gun Flush. That way any other employee can look at that container, recognize what it is, and if they need to, they can go to the MSDS or the SDS and determine what the material is. The exception to this is that anytime you move into a secondary container for your own personal use and you're going to have control of that container, it does not have to be labeled, because you took it from a container that was labeled and you recognized and moved it into a container that's going to be in your sole use. That is the only exception to that. It is the responsibility of the local safety director and any employee purchasing, receiving hazardous materials to ensure that product has a proper label. If the product does not have proper labeling, employees may not use the product until proper labeling is acquired. All employees should understand how to read basic labels. The color-coded labels, which are ones that identify your health and flammability and reactivity, are the basic NFPA label and the HMIS 1 and 2 and 3 label. And they look like this. That's the NFPA, HMIS 1 and 2, HMIS 3. On the NFPA labels, the important thing to remember is that they're rated 0 through 4 for health, flammability, reactivity, and personal protection, and 0 being the least offensive and 4 being the most. So if you see a 4, you need to take notice and take care of that. If you see a 3, you need to look at that and take note of that. If you see a 2, you need to figure out what you need to do. It's only the second level, but you still need to know that there is some. With regards to health, a 2 means caution, a 1 means caution, maybe irritating. A 2 means warning, may be harmful if inhaled or absorbed. A 3 means corrosive or toxic, avoid skin contact or inhalation. And 4 is danger. As a rule, you're not going to work with anything at EPR that is a 4. If you see a 4, please take note and make sure you know what you're dealing with. White is special hazards. W is for water reactive, which means it will react with water. OX is for an oxidizing agent, which means it'll break something else down. Acid and alkali are your acids and your bases, which we discussed earlier. And corrosive means it's either acid or alkali, which means it will be corrosive. HMIS labels, which is Hazardous Materials Identification System. These are the ones that we just looked at. These are the square labels. And again, they are rated the same way as the NFPA labels are, 0 through 4, with 0 being the least offensive and 4 being the most. So you need to be able to recognize those and know what that 0 is good, 4 is strongly something that you need to take precautions with. The HMIS 1 and 2 labels have a yellow section, which has reactivity, and an orange, which is physical hazard, and a white is personal protection. Again, the breakdown of all these labels are on this sheet. You need to read it and be familiar with those labels. DOT labels that you're going to see in the process of working with EPR are basically these labels. And they are just a flammable liquid label, a corrosive label, and then a flammable gas label. And you won't actually see these. These were on the old spray bombs when they were shipped in great quantities, and we don't do that anymore. This is a hazardous waste label. Again, they're small, they don't show up well on the screen, but you need to look at them in here. Again, if you see a flammable liquid label, you know that you need to take cautions and not have sources of ignition. If you see a corrosive label, you know that you need to wear gloves and eyeglasses, protective eyeglasses. The hazardous waste label is for our purposes, and you'll just need to be familiar with them, but you won't be doing anything with them. It's for the drums that get treated by the hazardous waste haulers. Which brings us to the summary. Upon completion of this hazardous communication program, the employee should be aware of they have the legal right to know about all hazards present in the workplace, the hazards associated with the job, the level of responsibility that he or she has in the program, what an MSDS or an SDS is and how to read one, which includes the hazards associated with the chemical or routes of exposure, signs of exposure, first aid measures, and personal protective equipment required. The basics of the NFPA and HMIS labels, the personal protective equipment available to you as an employee, the different levels of PPE or protective required as applies to the application of different coatings and adhesives, and where the MSD sheets and a copy of this program exists in their local office. It's important to note again, like I said, as a new employee, you're going to be trained, you're going to be with someone who already is aware of what's going on, and they're going to guide you and show you and make sure that you are, as a Tier 2 employee, they're going to make sure that you are following these guidelines. If you need to be wearing gloves or wearing special glasses, safety glasses, they'll let you know this. This page 21 is just a larger representation. These are for your purposes only of the labels, so that you can go through rather than just looking at the little ones I have, and this kind of gives you an idea of these labels. Again, you'll have this book for your purposes, so if you want to pull it up and look at it, so you can use this as a reference point, then you can look at this for the labels. Page 24 through 31 is nothing more than a set of definition of terms. This is something that I included. It's not even required by the government, but this allows you to be able to look at all these terms on an MSDS and an SDS, and this will tell you what they are. But again, if you go to this and you read this and you still don't understand what they're talking about, please talk to the manager. And if you can't get an answer there, the manager will come to me and I can tell you what all of these stand for. And then the last thing, once you've completed this, and the manager has sat with you, and we know that you understand what's going on, and you've acknowledged that you know what's going on, we have a hazardous communication completion sign-off, at which you must sign, and will go on your file. You can have a copy of that if you want, but you will get a copy of the HazMat. And that's all for today and for the hazardous communication.